It's Policy Week at CoinDesk, and joining us to discuss the regulatory outlook in the U.S. is SEC Commissioner Hester Peirce, who's been on this show various times and is now coming to give us the latest update. Welcome, Commissioner Peirce.
Thank you, Emily. It's great to be here. And of course, I've got to give you my disclaimer, which is that my views are my own views, not necessarily those of the SEC or my fellow commissioners.
Got it. Welcome back to the show. So I don't know if you just watched the previous segment. Congressman Davidson called the SEC asleep at the wheel, putting aside that, right, he was referring to, the FTX drama and a criticism that I'm sure you've seen. It's been going around is that the SEC should have done more, or they did the wrong thing. And I guess let's just start off with that. I mean, obviously, you've been critical of various elements of the SEC for a while. You just have a new statement out. You've been critical of regulation by enforcement. But how do you respond to this specific critique, which, we've seen a lot on crypto Twitter, which is that, the SEC mishandled in some way the whole FTX implosion and just didn't do enough or did the wrong thing?
Well, I don't want to speak specifically to any particular enforcement action. I mean, we did bring in enforcement action recently against FTX, and that's ongoing. But what I will say is that the approach we've been taking, which is an enforcement-centric approach, is clearly not the right way to go about regulating this space. So, it is important to bring enforcement actions when there's fraud and when that touches our jurisdiction, which depends, of course, on whether securities are involved. It depends whether it's in the United States. And, of course, criminal authority is not ours. So, given that, we have played a role in pursuing frauds. But we've also tried to use our enforcement authority to go after unregistered securities offerings. And I think there really is a better approach to that. And that is writing a set of regulations. Now, it's up to Congress to decide whether or not we have the authority in this area, but there certainly are some things that we could be doing already. We have exemptive authority, which we could be using to tailor our disclosure rules, for example. So we certainly could have been taking a much more proactive approach on the regulation side, and I think that would have served everyone well.
Commissioner Peirce, just even simplify this even further, though, because you've written very thoughtfully on this, and you've been expressing these views for a long time, and I think a lot of people are now seeing the wisdom of them. But if we're looking at something like an FTX situation specifically, right, where you have this sort of offshore exchange, it implodes, it causes a ripple effect through the industry, like. We know that regulation by enforcement probably was not the best approach, but what should the SEC, what could the SEC have done? Like, if we could have gone back in time, I mean, what would have been the you said clear guidelines, or if you could just break down a little bit, like what would have been a better situation, a better SEC regulatory framework that could have prevented something like this, if it could have even been prevented?
Well, I think Congressman Davidson made the point that if you have a good legal and regulatory framework in the United States, then it's more likely that companies and projects will want to be here and work here, and that people will avail themselves of U.S. entities. So I think that's one piece of it. Now, I think in the crypto area, it is complicated because there are some things that clearly fall within our jurisdiction. There are other things that we probably need to get congressional directive from, and Congress may decide that the SEC is not the right regulator for some or all of crypto, and so that is necessary for us to understand as well. But we could have laid the groundwork, and we could have gone to Congress and said, look, here's what we think we have authority over, here's where we think we need clear authority, more clear authority, or we need additional authority. And we could have done that jointly with the CFTC, which I think would have been particularly productive. But instead, we've all been bringing enforcement actions and not really sat down and had those important conversations.
So, Commissioner Peirce, with that said, it seems to me you don't believe that it's clear as to what commission currently should regulate the spot markets. Now, do you think that that's the case? I want to confirm that you don't think that it's clear. If you don't think it's clear, do you think Congress should act as soon as possible to create the rules that would determine what commission is, the CFTC or if it's the SEC or something else, should be monitoring and regulating the spot crypto markets?
The arguments that have come from the Commission regarding crypto tokens, I think, are not legally precise enough, and those are the grounds on which people say yes, the SEC should have the spot market jurisdiction, which is there are a lot of statements out there saying there are 10,000 tokens out there, and most of those are securities, and that would sort of imply that the spot markets are ours to regulate. But I argue that the legal analysis is really much more nuanced than that, and I think we need to exercise that nuanced analysis. Token offerings, that's one thing. You assess those to see whether or not they satisfy the Howey test, but that really doesn't tell you anything about the underlying token, about whether or not that itself is a security. And that is what would be trading on a spot market. And so then the question is, do we think there needs to be a federal regulator for crypto spot markets? And if so, does Congress want that to be the SEC, the CFTC, self-regulatory entity, some other entity? Does Congress even think there needs to be a federal spot market regulator? If Congress decides, yes, we want to have a spot market regulator at the federal level, I can make a good case that the SEC would be good at doing that. We have a lot of experience regulating exchanges. We have a lot of experience regulating retail-oriented exchanges. So one could make that case. But I think the first question is to decide, is there a call for a federal regulator of spot markets? Some people say absolutely yes. Others might not agree with that.
Commissioner, you made some remarks recently at an event, and the closing remarks, the closing statements were something like, last year was so brutal for crypto that some people want to relegate it to the dustbin of failed experiments. And then interestingly, you said, rather than swiping left on crypto, we should remember that new technologies sometimes take a long time to find their footing. You ended very interestingly by saying, sure, sometimes people make very bad decisions on behalf of themselves or their families, but handing over the keys to the government does not ensure that decisions will be good. And you end in the last line by saying, I guess we'll be taking, if you think the government should step in when people make stupid decisions, I guess we'll be taking over your favorite dating app too. Date anyone, ? Is what you ended on. I just want to understand, everyone keeps talking about the CFTC, the SEC, and Congress not doing their part, regulation by enforcement, but the role of the people, are you holding them responsible too as investors for not being responsible? But if you're doing that, then do you hold the SEC and regulatory bodies themselves are responsible for not advocating enough caution?
I've always been someone who believes that regulation is a last resort and not a first resort, because doing regulation well is very difficult, and it's always better to try to do things through the marketplace, for example, through voluntary efforts. Sometimes regulation is necessary, so that's an instance when then we have to figure out, how do we design the regulation to work as well as it can work. So part of that message, though, when I give the message that I think regulation is not a first resort, but it's a last resort, I say, but that means that we as citizens have a responsibility for our own decisions, for making good decisions and for bearing the consequences when they're not good. And I think a lot of people agree with me when times are good, that it's better to have a broader, freer domain where individuals can make their own choices. Perhaps fewer people agree with me when things go wrong. And then they come to the government and they say, well, why didn't you fix it? And my response is, don't look first to the government to fix your problems. Again, this is not to say that my heart definitely goes out to people who were hurt in recent events. And I never want to see that. And I do think that the SEC has a role to play in educating people about making investment decisions, about diversifying their investments, about thinking about not having a fear of missing out, for example. And that applies to the securities markets. It also applies to other kinds of markets. Those lessons are very applicable. I think we need to do a better job educating our children earlier in life about financial decision making. So that doesn't have to be the SEC.
Right.
I think that should be the schools. But so certainly I do preach a message of individual responsibility and limited government, and where government acts, I think we should try to do it as well as possible. And I think we haven't done that here in this space.
We don't know what the textbook for education is, though. That's the problem, right? When Congress doesn't make up their mind and SEC and CFTC have different opinions within their organizations, it becomes difficult for the teacher to tell the student, this is what you should be learning and this is what you should be cautious about. Unfortunately, we don't have much more time, but thank you very much, Commissioner Peirce. We'll definitely keep talking about this in the future.